recording. I want to introduce our advisors and research partners, Doctors Miyabe Shields, Markus Roggen. Riley just had a sweet baby boy, so I imagine she is busy. I do not blame her for taking time off for herself and her new bundle of joy. And we've got our international Baddat from way down at the other end of the world. So thank you guys for joining us, but we do this call, we have our research team here and we hope to answer lots of the questions, but we also want you to jump in and talk to us about, what you're experiencing at your grows, at your facilities, what questions you might have as we're giving answers, and just make this a very community-based conversation. These questions come from you guys. There's a lot of them, so I have to sort through them. So if I don't hit your question, I apologize, but I try to kind of combine questions where we hit most of them. And so that's really cool. Our next meeting, though, is for October. Again, if you have specific questions, we always send out a link asking for questions. So just sign up for that and shoot them over. And again, we'll try to get to them. We do have some new companies. These are just specific, commercial companies. We have lots of other growers that may be consultants or, maybe they're home growers or that sort of thing, but specific cultivation companies we want to shout out to: Remedy Cultivation, the Fresh Connection out of Boston, Legacy Cannabis in Duluth, Dark Horse Cannabis, Arkansas, and Sundrance Family Farms. So welcome everybody. We're very excited to have you here. I think there might be one person on not muted, if you wouldn't mind doing that, just where everybody can hear each other when you're not speaking. A couple of updates before we jump into questions. One is, please go and check out the Grower Tools page. This is something we're doing because, I, through consulting, through having my own facility, there's just some things that Excel files just aren't good enough at. Maybe your formulas get changed, or maybe you don't know how to use Excel formulas. And so we want to provide some tools to where that can be quick and easy and really help you out. So the one of late is called a timer tool. And so what you're able to do is put in, the time you want lights on, the time you want lights off, your applied photo period. It even has the ability to put in the par that you're applying, even ramp up and ramp down times if you want to do the sunset sort of sunrise sunset sort of thing. And it'll tell you, well, how much, total DLI am I losing by doing this ramp up? And then it gives you a big picture. It might seem silly and too simple, but I know so many growers that have messed up their flowering cycle simply because somebody set the timer wrong. Or maybe you're American and you didn't grow up with a military family, so you don't understand the 24-hour time when you're having to convert it on the fly. So it's just something easy there for you to put it all in and it shoots you out. Yes, my lights need to go on here. Yes, my lights need to go off here for X amount of time. So check it out. It's kind of cool. And we got some others coming along the line too. Next, we're super excited to be hitting the gas on SOS again. We've got some really cool updates. Miyabe, I'll let you share those. And we're excited to hear it.
Yeah, totally. So we have been gathering information because if people remember from the previous phase of the study, a smoking machine was used to smoke the cannabis and then capture the molecules that were in the smoke. And the process of doing this involves a machine that has automated methodology. There's protocols that it follows for taking certain amounts of puffs, how fast and how much and how hard it's puffing, the flow rate of the puff, the amount of time, and then something called an inner puff interval, or in between the puffs. And all of those methods have been developed for the tobacco industry. And all of these metrics, specifically around what's called puff topography, or the shape and volume of the puffs that we're taking when we're smoking flower. These have been heavily researched in tobacco for how they can affect all sorts of things. I mean, I was deep in the rabbit hole. Like I said, Allison, I was in this rabbit hole where they were relating it to sensory experience, actually, in that puff topography is linked to sensory experiences of smoking. And the reason why is because if you think about it, we all have different lung volumes, lung capacities, and then we all smoke differently. But it actually is cool. We've been gathering data on people smoking cannabis, and there are 3 main groups of people that, like, main types of puffing on cannabis, and they are distinct from how people smoke on cigarettes. One of them is like intense, and it's a big, fast, intense burst with like a large volume. The second one is like a slower pull that takes a little bit longer and is less intense. And then the third one is people who puff it twice every time, the double puffers, which the first time we identified that was in Dink Duchess Hash Smoker, and was really funny to see. And then now to see it replicated, that it's one of the 3, that these are just sort of common types. And there's, variability between us, but we're in the process of writing that up. So I was doing the literature review, which is doing like background on research that has been previously done on this before. And it's also pretty exciting because this hasn't been done before in cannabis. But studying the smoke when so much of our product is smoked and when so many of us prefer smoking makes a lot of sense. And not just from the standpoint of studying it from the negatives, but in the positives too. And we're really excited to be part of developing better methodologies so that now we can go back, and not only us, but everyone else who wants to study smoke can know what are the topographies, like what are the common ways in which people do smoke, because it affects the chemistry. So the last thing I'm going to say is just that the next time you're smoking, if you're burning one down, you're pulling on it, you're thinking about it, you're thinking it's a chemical reaction. And when you have the flow rate of air coming through the volume of air, it's going to adjust the temperature, right? Like the faster the pull and the more air, you'll get like a hotter ember. And you get different types of chemical reactions at different temperatures and at different thresholds of presence of oxygen, for example. Like if you're pulling in the air really quickly, usually there's a period after that ember, if it's really hot, where there won't be oxygen because the fire has depleted the oxygen. But at a certain point, if you're pulling fast enough, I'm sure the volume of oxygen is enough. And these are types of things that we haven't yet studied with cannabis, but are beginning to, and it's really exciting. So we're preparing it, and people will be able to see pretty pictures of it soon. But we're excited to have found some early evidence of some things that we probably already knew just from smoking, those of us who smoke a lot of flower. And it's really good and important to be able to put numbers on that, so that then when we do study things, they're relevant to what the rest of us are smoking.
Absolutely. And now that we have this, we can move on to our next experiments and start to understand what else is changing the smokability, especially things that we're doing in post-harvest as well as there in cultivation. So we've got our robot ready to be trained and ready to smoke properly. It's very exciting. Next, so a little update on the PIP research trials we're doing. If you don't know, we've partnered with PIP Horticulture, where we have 3 different controlled chambers where we're applying different rates of airflow. And today we are on replicate 2 of these trials. We think we're going into week 3 of flower. And from the first experiment, all I have to say is I was wrong. My theory was wrong. It's difficult. It's difficult to guess what's going to happen. I guess that's what makes research exciting, is because even when you think you know best and you think you understand what's going to happen, you get surprised. And so you got to put your ego aside and follow the science of what it's telling us and what we're trying to do. So in the first study, what I mean by I was wrong, and we'll put these results out, but just briefly, in theory, when a plant is receiving higher airflow, the stem becomes a lot stronger and the plant does not grow as tall, right? That is a very generalized reference of what happens when a plant has movement. And so I figured with our high treatment, we would get much shorter plants. And actually, it was quite opposite. and that the highest airflow treatment were the tallest. And I think a lot of that stems from the obvious increased transpiration that we saw, much more feeding, meaning much more nutrient uptake, and so the plants were taller and ultimately had higher yields. Now that's only going to 200 feet per minute, so it's not extreme air. So this next study does incorporate a higher level to see kind of where we stand and what that cutoff is of really causing damage with too high of airflow. So that was just an interesting kind of little sneak peek of what we're learning and what we'll continue to learn and shape with our studies. Couple of things. The Southern Illinois University Cannabis Science Symposium is happening next month. I know it's a little bit late notice, but September 19th, they're having a really great conference. I've not been yet, but the speakers they have lined up, and I know the team from SIU is really great. So if that's something you're close to or nearby, it definitely would be worth it. We'll all be out at MJ Biz this year, which is creeping up faster than I would like, but we'll be planning on being there and would love to meet up and meet in person. Sorry, I'm just admitting people. So yeah, so that is it with all the updates. There's a lot of other research going on, but I want to save time for these questions because that's what it's about. And first, Markus, like I told you, we're going to do the one and only chemistry/extraction specific question. So we'll let you take lead on that. And the question is, for extraction and formulation, which methods best preserve minor cannabinoids and terpenes?
You're muted. You're muted.
I assume that means for which solvent system. So three main solvent systems are CO2, hydrocarbons, and alcohols. So if we just separate terpenes from cannabinoids as big blocks, the basic question is how soluble is a compound or a group of compounds in the solvent, and so washes out. And terpenes and hydrocarbons are best matched in solubility. And terpenes and ethanol are like the furthest apart in solubility of those three solvents. CO2 is somewhere in the middle. But CO2 has a very low overall solubility. So a kilo of CO2 can carry less terpene than a kilo of hydrocarbon. So you just need more solvent. So there's also the question of extraction speed. So therefore, and that's why you see hydrocarbons being generally done to make sauce, to make diamonds or so on. So like everything like high terpene content, you use hydrocarbons for that, just because it's most simple to do. Then on the other hand, cannabinoids are better matched in solubility to CO2 and ethanol or alcohols. Particular cannabinoid acids, so THC acids, CBD acids. So before you decarboxylate something, they fit better to ethanol or isopropanol. We are talking small variations, so you can still extract all compounds with any of the solvents. It's just a question of speed and precision. So if you want to bump up your terpene fraction compared to your cannabinoids and you want to have more flavor, use a hydrocarbon. If you have a lot of material and want all the cannabinoids out of it, use an alcohol. So that's why you see ethanol or isopropanol being used as the extraction solvent of choice in the hemp industry. It's a good solvent match. And the other aspect is it's really easy to scale a bucket, because ethanol extraction is or alcohol extraction is basically a big bucket. While for CO2 and hydrocarbons, you need a pressure system. Minor cannabinoids versus the main cannabinoids, THC and CBD, there isn't really anything to like. You could exploit small solubility differences with very precise controls of a supercritical CO2 instrument, but none of them are like really precise or good enough to do much of a ratio change there. If you want to push up your minor cannabinoids or isolate them and get rid of your THC, you need other methods. You need chromatography, column chromatography, or liquid-liquid chromatography. It's a messy process. Many have tried. I haven't really seen anything that makes sense. It actually might make more sense to synthesize minor cannabinoids from scratch instead of trying to get them out of hemp or THC or cannabis. What else can I say? There was a question, terpenes and cannabinoids. It leaves. I would more put that into flavor and intoxication aspect. And flavor is terpenes plus other aroma compounds, and research by Abstract Labs has been quite instrumental there. We don't see them, we can definitely smell them, and they all fall into the solubility class of being well expressed or extracted with hydrocarbons.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
So if you're using ethanol, but you're cooling it to negative 80 degrees Celsius, you retain all the small molecules, but are able to get all of the cannabinoids out as well, correct?
So the reason you cool it down is so why are you cooling it down?
Me?
Or why
To
would
retain,
someone cool it down, like from your view?
so to retain the small molecules, like to reduce the volatility of the reaction and therefore keeping the stuff you want and not the stuff you don't want.
Yeah, so that is right. So you cool down a solvent system to actually reduce its solubility or solvent power. So by cooling down ethanol, you will see it won't be green anymore because it doesn't co-extract the chlorophyll. Also, because you can have the whole system cold, you can use fresh frozen material. You can use so the water extent. So in chemistry, it's always everything happens always at the same time, but they do happen at different rates. And so by changing temperatures, you change the ratios, or you expand the band gaps between different extraction processes. So if you cool everything down, you get everything that dissolves really fast still dissolved, and the stuff that dissolves slowly, like chlorophyll, dissolves even slower in comparison. So if you would do your minus 80 extraction and just wait a week, you would get the same thing as if you extract for 10 minutes at room temperature. You just have more time in between the different aspects of it. So if you have something that dissolves better in ethanol than it dissolves than other compounds, and my wife tells me that I'm too excited about this topic and I'm too loud. So sorry. Yeah, so you cool it down and you do not extract the unwanted compounds as fast anymore. You can prevent them of overloading the system. But sorry, Miyabe, you have your hand up.
Oh, I just had I agree with what you're saying, Markus, about the differences in solvents and solubility. But like outside of that, I wanted to comment on starting material, because if we're talking about material that's going to have the largest amount of aromatics or volatile compounds, then like live, fresh, frozen material will be very different from dried and cured flower. And so that's just one, like a practical component that I just thought of and I didn't want to forget when we're having this discussion is that absolutely the solvent type and the method of extraction so important. And then, but like the starting material that we start with, like if you are going, this should not affect the cannabinoids except for maybe CBN formation that does happen to really small extents with aging cannabis at the 60/60 or the standard, lower temp, like lower cure parts, but so for the cannabinoids, it doesn't make as big a difference, but especially but terps and other volatiles, if you're doing something fresh frozen, it will have way more of those, just because if not, they're off gassing constantly. Like you can smell them while you're drying and curing. You can smell them coming off of the starting material because you're smelling them in your nose. So live material will get you more of that. And then I was gonna make an argument for hash because of Allison's information on the coating on the outside of trichomes and how. Was that last month's CRC, Allison, that you were talking about that? Maybe it was the month before that. You were talking about puncturing. You and David were talking about puncturing the outside of the trichome, and the trichome itself being where all of these molecules are being secreted, having their own protection mechanism that keeps them inside, and that if they're unpunctured, which is really difficult because having washed hash only a couple times, let me say, like you could try to be delicate, but there's ice cubes in there and stuff, and like it. Like you want to see it, you can see with a microscope whether or not they're getting like punctured around and like beat up, or whether or not they were beat up in the first place, which is probably my problem. But like I think that it's interesting, the idea of that being the most secure vessel for these volatiles, because they're never going to be exposed then to oxygen or to air, whereas any type of other mechanism where they're not unsealed, they're dissolved into something else. The moment you start doing that, you're going to start losing them, right? Because like they're volatile. So it's just something I thought was really interesting, and definitely like something in the future that it's like hard to conceive because they are so delicate that you would like know or understand the puncture ratio. But something I was thinking about just for preservation standpoint, and I know that's more size exclusion. Hash is not truly an extraction. Some people consider it an extraction, but technically I think it's size exclusion.
Yeah, so yeah, thank you. You got lots of new aspects to it that I hadn't considered, and definitely are worth pointing. Yes, you're right. Ice water hash is not an extraction, it's a separation. Yeah, so size exclusion.
Pressing to rosin is it now extracted?
Technically, it's not an extraction. Yes, it's a mechanical separation. You press it really hard. So for extraction, you have one phase, and then you use another phase, or another liquid to then dissolve your compounds over, separate them out, and then bring them out of that solution. So you need a solvent for extraction. And obviously ice water hash and rosin is not doesn't have a solvent. So but Miyabe has two important aspects to the extraction question, or to expand on the extraction. Not only what is the best solvent to extract, but also what is the best protocol to get your material in, so to keep all your compounds so that you can extract it. So fresh frozen material obviously has the most volatiles, aromas, compounds, terpenes, and others. Flash frozen works very well with hydrocarbons, because fresh frozen the plant is still full of water. So hydrocarbons don't extract water, do not mix with water, so you can use fresh frozen material and still extract your compounds that you want. At the same time, you can use frozen material in ethanol, but ethanol does dissolve water. It mixes well with water. Anyone who drinks liquor understands that concept. So you then have a problem that you co-extract a lot of water, and you have to regenerate your alcohol. Also, the water becomes a co-solvent, and you change the whole solvent system. So that's something you have to consider. So if you have too much water in your ethanol, you are not extracting terpenes anymore. You just don't dissolve in that anymore. And we tried fresh frozen and CO2. I think many of my coworkers still have that smell haunting them at night, because that was a very bad experience. So I do not recommend trying fresh frozen as CO2 extractor. So probably hydrocarbons is there the best. And then the other aspect that Miyabe mentioned was that a trichome encases the terpenes and prevents oxidation. And so that is actually a good point. While extraction is just a movement of molecules from one vessel into another, we have to consider the whole system around it, and oxidation is a reaction that can occur. So if you add temperature, air, water to anything, there will be chemical reaction happening. So if you have temperature and water present and then terpenes, you're going to hydrolyze these terpenes and they go to reek. So a system that is enclosed and prevents any air or oxygen getting in preserves your aroma better than an open bucket of ethanol extraction. So that's a good point there. So that's why I'm a very big advocate against ovens for decarboxylation. Like using a vac oven or like a air dried oven to decarboxylate your oil afterwards, where you just basically have air rushing over an extremely hot oil, is the best way of spoiling it. And you have experienced that yourself. You put the oil in and it's like light yellow, and you pull it out and it's dark brown. Like you can visually see how this stuff degraded. When you decarboxylate under an inert atmosphere, so CO2 or nitrogen, you don't get that color change. Allison might remember in California where we worked together, we actually used the CO2 extractor for decarboxylation. So at the end of the extraction, when we had all the oil in our separator vessel, we just heated the shit out of the separator when everything was still under CO2, and we did the decarboxylation there. And we got a very light yellow oil out instead of the dark brown you're used to.
So I think it's really interesting what you just said and the next question. But everybody keep that in mind when you're talking about temperature and oxygen and light. But a really interesting comment. Murphy, I'm excited to see you here. You are the crystallization queen, I hear. I would love if you would touch on it for just a second of how you think that would be a fair replacement, especially for hydrocarbons, if you don't mind.
Sure. Crystallization is one of my favorite tools in the lab, simply because it's so easy, and it does. It's focused around solubility, but the ways that you influence it are very practical, because with crystallization, since you're generally operating in cool to cold temperatures until you start evaporating solvents, it feels very low risk. So you don't have some of the solvent incompatibility issues like Markus was talking about bringing water into the equation. You don't have, the need for external heat. So it's a very low risk way to try to separate things, because your yield losses are not lost. You're just kind of transferring things from one jar to another. And so through crystallization, we can kind of take advantage of size and, sort of molecule shape and tendency. For example, with hemp farmers, they're focusing on crystallization, even though a lot of them use ethanol as their primary extraction solvent, simply because CBD is so easy to crystallize out of batches. CBG is similarly very likely to crystallize. Those lattices form quickly, they form easily, and that's a very convenient, like strangely so, very convenient feature of these cannabinoids, because, people much smarter than me work very hard to develop molecules that will crystallize as clean as these and often fail. So through crystallization, you can group these cannabinoids. And what I love about it too is that in many cases, with CBD and CBG being probably the most significant exceptions, but with a lot of the others, you have situations like delta 9 THC, which doesn't crystallize, but the acidic form THCA does. And this allows you to separate cannabinoids from each other simply by kind of their shape and consistency. So through isolating CBD, nobody talks about this, but I'm not the cops, so I will. But you isolate THC too, every time. And if you were to take the garbage that you have in a bucket somewhere in your facility and continue to expose that to new crystallization conditions, you can continue to crystallize things out. And since crystallization is really kind of a popularity contest, which cannabinoids are the most abundant and the most likable inside of a given solution, the more times you repeat the process, the more refined it can become. And so if you look at a big complex batch of flower, it's very easy to say, here's the most abundant cannabinoid, crystallize that out. Now I have the remainder of the batch. What's the next most abundant cannabinoid? And crystallize that out. And sometimes crystallizing it out puts the desired product in the solvent or puts the desired product at the bottom of your container. But what's great is you don't have to know which place it's going to go. You can just repeat the process and attempt to replicate the process. You can take crystals you've collected, redissolve them, and start over again. And what I also appreciate about it is the more times you repeat this process, the faster and easier it gets, because the product gets cleaner and cleaner. And along those same lines, you're going to purify terpenes through the process similarly, because some of them will crystallize too. So there are a lot of ways to use it as a tool, and it's very accessible and approachable. You can crystallize in alcohol. The question will be how patient you're willing to be. But you know, the cleaner you get your solution and the more times you repeat it, almost all of these cannabinoids can be separated either by pushing them into the solvent or solidifying them at the bottom of a container, which I find to be an incredible shortcut.
So you're telling me there's crystal terps?
There's a couple that will crystallize, and those are, you know, you've got to continue to refine and clean that process. But you know, through, for example, just crystallizing THCA, a lot of us get what we call terps, and it's this liquid goo jar. Terps are not the most abundant compound in that jar, unfortunately. Silly name for us to apply to it, but because it's usually all of the minor cannabinoids as well as THC. And along with it, you'll have a lot of terpenes and you'll have a lot of flavorant type categories and especially fats. And so I think, you know, part of it is going to be the fresher that material is, but also just the more times we refine that sort of mother liquor supernatant, the more things we're going to be able to separate and pull apart. And so those terps are first going to go most likely into your solvent if you're using a hydrocarbon. And then from there, you can continue to refine them. And so a lot of times when I've seen things crystallize, it's because I put it in a freezer, went and did something else.
Forgot about it.
Super good SOP. Write that down, everybody. Put it in the freezer, go do something else.
That is absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing. So that was the extraction question. Unless anybody has any last minute questions or comments to add to that, we'll move on to the next one. Okay. I think we've got a lot of cultivators with us, so let me say enough of that. Okay, I'm just trying to open up my document. Okay, can you see question 2 and a graph? Okay. All right, so I kind of combined a bunch of questions that go into number 2. But in short, they're all about post-harvest. So, you know, what storage conditions such as temperature, oxygen, and light preserve potency? How important is air exchange during drying? If we exchange air, what is the purpose? Since exchanging air can fluctuate temperature and humidity, changes vapor pressure, is that bad? I've seen growers that reach up to 3,000 ppm of carbon dioxide, and is this a problem? So I know that's a lot of different types of questions, but as I was saying earlier, what Markus was hitting on about extraction and what can happen with oils, it's very similar to what can happen when those oils are still on the plant material. And I'll show this, and I'll show it all the time and forever, because it is very, very useful to look at and understand. So, time is a metric of oxidation and change. Oxygen obviously is light, but we dry and we store and we cure all in the dark. So we'll kind of take that metric and throw it out the window. But water is a big one, and arguably the most important. So looking at this water activity, moisture content, reactive rate interaction graph, I always point out here at the highest water activity, it's when the plant material is at the most wet it can be. You've got a lot of opportunity for things to happen. Life needs water to survive. And so all of its functions and changes and oxidation and browning, all of this decreases as we pull the water out. So if you're Markus, in his world, he's hoping his flowers dry. And so, he's not dealing with these reaction changes that dote on water. But if we're talking about post-harvest conditions, we are worried about that, because we're going from a point of full moisture content all the way down to something that's acceptable for a finished product. And where is that happy balance, and how long do we need to keep it in these certain time periods based off some of these reactions that's happening? Now, all of that is theory based on what's happening in other plants, but we're starting to chip away at it and starting to understand what of these reactions are we wanting to speed up and what are we wanting to slow down. So to start to answer some of these questions, I just wanted to point that out and show you a few snippets from my research that's happened specifically this year. It's not been published yet, so some of the graphs are certainly not finished, but I'm hoping it'll get my point across. So water activity over time, this is from the day of harvest all the way to I think it's 56 days here. At some point, there is a transition of where the flower's bucked and put into a container. That is about at this point where the line starts to stabilize. But I want you to pay attention here to how fast we lower the water activity and at what point it really begins to basically go horizontal. So, right here at day, 13, 12, 13, 14, it has hit the water activity that we want. And so just keep that date, that range in your mind as we look at some of the other graphs of things that are going on, because, we separate out in our minds, or traditionally in the cannabis space, that drying is one thing and curing is another. And I really believe that it's all in one process. There's drying, which is curing, which is water removal. It's really the area with at least that we've achieved to measure yet that we see all the changes happening. So that in those 12 days and before, when the plant has that higher water activity, this is where we see those changes. So, to me, drying is really that 12-day, 14-day window is really drying and curing. And after that, it's just water homogenization and holding. Now, again, there could be things one day we decide to measure that has proven, curing for 2 months or, a year. People say curing does something. And there's still space in my mind to support that, yes, potentially, but at least to nothing we've measured so far. But we'll see. But you mentioned CO2, and so I want to show this graph back to the others, because here, this is actually a different timeline. So we're at 12 days, and it's CO2 over time. This would be right at harvest. Now, sorry, I removed the key. The red is a drying environment. They both have the same amount of biomass, so it's the same amount of plant material in each room. The blue room is one that's very well sealed and enclosed. The air is circulated, and they try not to open the door. The other graph is indicating, or the other red line is indicating a room where there's a lot of air circulation or influx, and so the CO2 that the plant is producing is leaving. So it's interesting to think about it a couple of ways. Of one, the plant is putting out a lot of CO2, and in this example it was 100 pounds or so of biomass. But if you're in a giant commercial facility, I have seen it all day for 5,000 parts per million, which that's the point where it starts to become dangerous for worker safety. I think 5,000 ppm is what OSHA regulates as not a safe working environment. So it's important to understand what your rooms are producing. Are your chambers sealed? And if they're not, or if you don't know, something easy you can do is take a gas tank of CO2 into the room, open it just for a second, and then leave, and you can track how fast the CO2 leaves from your room, just to check sealability of the room. But my point here, in addition, is that the CO2 accumulation is dropping off at about day 8, right at that same sort of window that we're seeing, that we're seeing our water activity decrease to this certain amount. CO2 stops. Right here where we see enzymatic activity stop because water activity is so low. We're seeing this graph in action, basically. And so if we keep pushing on to that, I got ahead of myself here. Here's pigment degradation over time. So this is looking at the same, this is 35 days. We're looking at 470 would be carotenoids, and then we've got chlorophylls A and B right here. That's what these nanometers are representing. And so, here, day 10, we're really at the bottom of where, we're at the bottom of where absorbance is going to drop. It's again a flag right there within that 8 to 12 day window. Your pigment loss has stopped. So that tells you, your biochemistry is ceasing. You've not changed the temperature. It's virtually because of that plant material not having the water to complete that biochemistry that's happening. So just kind of some neat figures right here to show. Because everybody says, well, what's smokability? It's degradation of chlorophyll. It is. It's a good bit of degradation. I mean, you're losing about 75, 77% of all of those pigments going from harvest to, not even till the end of cure, but right here at the end of where you're getting to the dryness level you're wanting it. These are actual pictures from that experiment where you can see this is at harvest, and then this is, I think this was day 56 at the end. So very interesting to kind of see all of those correlate and come together. But I'll pop back up here one more thing, and then I'll get everybody else's feedback. Water is important, temperature is important, but the other thing that I'm still so keen on truly understanding is those other gases that are produced those first 10 days. And so ethylene is one of those. Coming from the floriculture industry, ethylene is one of the things most studied for those who have cut flowers or those who are sending unrooted cuttings, because ethylene is your death gas. If it's accumulating in the bag that you have your plants in, they're going to degrade and die very, very quickly. Ethylene is what turns, green bananas to yellow bananas. It's the maturation chemical. So, I've we got into ethylene and sensing of it, but the problem is that with very expensive sensors, you're not getting a difference in the being able to tell the difference between the really high terpenes and the ethylene. Obviously, there's different types of analytical equipment that could read the difference, but at least with the first set of equipment I was using as ethylene sensors, you know, it's not necessarily reliable results because there's so much interaction in the way that that sensor was working. So, you know, something else I want to look at there is ethylene, because if your CO2 is elevating, your ethylene definitely is as well. But maybe that's something good. Maybe we're wanting that degradation of chlorophyll, for example, to be sped up by the presence of ethylene. We don't know yet, but we're definitely working on it as an industry. So that's just some of the points I wanted to throw out for some of those questions. But I'd love to get everybody else's feedback or input or whatever else.
Allison, can I ask a question?
Sure.
There must be means by which they suppress ethylene, like when they're transporting bananas or other produce.
Yes.
Could you employ something like that and then see what the sensors show and see what happens?
Well, yes
Kind of
and
blanket
no.
out.
Well, all right. So, well, there's scrubbers you could put into a room, right? That would take up the ethylene being created by the plant material. But in addition, you know, working in cut flowers and unrooted cuttings, you know, it's a product called 1-MCT, and it's an antagonist for ethylene. And so you can spray it on live plants, and it'll cause the plant to not to recognize the ethylene, and so, you know, that senescence progression will stop. But I'm not sure how you would do it in a post-harvest or in a cannabis production manner. I mean, potentially you could spray it a week before harvest and it would slow down that or maybe even stop that production. But it's not something you could take and spray, say, as you just put it into the drying room. But yeah, there's definitely something that could be interesting. It's something I want to do is apply it prior to harvest. But again, we don't know if we want that ethylene to be there or not.
Yeah, right. Well, that's the exciting thing is like, let's see if we can find a way to figure out.
Yeah, exactly. Anybody else have any experience in post-harvest, and anybody seen any crazy levels of CO2 or, you know, done any changes to lower that and saw benefit from it? Well, if you haven't, make sure to put a sensor in your dry room, because at least having the information of what your baseline is power. And then from there, as science progresses and we start to understand, you know, what to do with that ethylene and what to do with CO2. Are we suppressing, you know, or higher levels of CO2 displacing the oxygen, making it a better environment in a well-sealed room? Potentially. So we'll see. Oh yeah, this was one more slide I wanted to show, because one of the questions had, well, you know, how does decarboxylation happen over time in a sealed pack? So in this example, it goes from being dried hanging plants up until day 14 to here, where they're put into just the bumblebee bins. Set points in the room that they were held with 60-60. Now keep in mind this was a type 3 plant. So, you know, we're starting with very low delta 9 in total to begin with, but there was very, I guess you could say, a linear response to decarboxylation over time, but only about 1% after 50 days, again at 60-60. Markus, I was going to ask you, I know you've done a lot with terpenes, and anybody else who knows this answer, please jump in. But what have you seen happen with terpenes over time, if that's been investigated? So,
Is he muted? Is he?
I don't know, you might got in trouble.
Maybe I have something interesting about terpenes that we haven't studied extensively in, at least in the context of cannabis, or I haven't seen it in herbs in general, but I was at a talk where they were talking about it in atmospheric science in the context of like atmosphere. And it's like well known that terpenes polymerize at atmospheric conditions. And I've just been fascinated by that for a while, just as a concept. And
explain to us what you mean by that.
Oh, polymerize means like link up together into like long chains. So a polymer is any sort of like long chain, like many plastics are polymers. So polymers are usually they're usually a repeating unit of something over and over and over again. And the example that I was at the talk I was at, pinene was one of the monoterps they were talking about, and I think myrcene might have been the other one. And these are atmospheric conditions they were talking about. It might not have been myrcene, maybe it's like eucalyptol. It was like a more circular one perhaps, but they link up and they polymerize, and I think that's interesting. That's just something that I think is fascinating that we have not. I'm always thinking about what we haven't what we haven't done yet that I think is fascinating. When it comes to like looking at over time the dry and cure and time, though, just in general with the terps, like we're talking about the volatility of the molecule. That means like how easily it's going to evaporate off and be given off of the flower, which generally has to do with size. So when I was mentioning like the monoterps being like, their monoterpenes are smaller, right? They're lighter, they're smaller molecules, and they often will evaporate faster over time first, right? And you'll lose all of those early and kind of be left with all of the heavier. And I think that interestingly, we like, or at least I associate light versus heavy. It does almost correlate with the molecule. It's not always true. Sometimes heavy can be, you know, savory, which has more to do with sulfurics and other types of volatiles than it does with the terps. So that's not necessarily true, but generally I do feel like, I mean, I'm literally just curing things like from the start right now from a run of autos, and the top of it so sharp and so fast and so monoterpene heavy in the beginning, right? And then as it continues to cure up, like it gets more complex, it changes, there's going to be oxidation, there's going to be like other reactions. I love that graph that you showed, the first graph that you showed. I've seen it once before, you've shown it, where it shows the different types of reactions that are occurring. Remember we were calling them zombie enzymes for a while? The idea that the enzymes are, you know, the enzymes are like, are they alive? Like, are they? They're still doing chemical reactions. Right. I guess they're not. Yeah, I mean, they're not like the whole cell, right? But they're
slower.
They're certainly still facilitating that. So I think that's really interesting. From what I've seen, I don't know that you could say overall with the terpene fraction whether it's linear or nonlinear at specific days and conditions yet, because I think that the best thing to know, or the best thing that we could look up, is individually what happens. And then that becomes very complicated, because the moment that you have things that we know individually have a certain equilibrium between itself and the air, right? Because whenever things are evaporating, that's an equilibrium between the thing that is evaporated and the thing that's not evaporated. So what you're saying about like when you remove something from one side of an equilibrium, it will continue to push it further. That's the theory behind like adding those scent packets to the flower. You know, you've seen that. You add the scent packets into the flower, and the theory of that, which is also the theory I've talked to a couple, or at least one legacy person who puts citrus peels, has used citrus peels to rehydrate, and like specifically citrus peels for tangy and citrus like flower. Mm-hmm. This is just someone talking to me, right? But I'm just saying that like that's the same theory. Those two things they're equilibrium pushers, right? You're filling your jar with the type of molecule that you want to stay in the flower, because if there's more of it in the air, it won't want to leave as easily. And I think these are things to take into account, is complex equilibrium. So generally, can we say the lighter ones leave first and the more volatile molecules leave first? Like, yes, definitely, generally true. But I don't know that, like, for each strain, for example, or even if we're talking about like conversion, mostly we're talking about flower here. We're talking about flower for growers and stuff, like just all the other matrices are going to be different as well, because you get a really complex equilibrium. And so, while I think that it's like definitely, I think it's definitely possible to like make generalized statements, I don't know that we would know for like individual things yet, because there's also just like hundreds of things that contribute to that fraction. I mean, terps and then terpenoids and then plus, everything else.
Yeah, it is fascinating. And, there's been times we've done small experiments, over the years where, I'm wanting to understand, how much what is the terpene concentration and ratio and, the plant as I smell it and as I grow it, right? And then there's what is representative there after it's dried. But then also that whole drying process is going to alter that some, and how you hold it and and so it's a complicated process where every piece matters, how much you've damaged the trichome heads over time, or if you continue to rehydrate, that's causing those trichome stalks to bend with the floral material, and they're physically hitting each other where they're rupturing and causing more volatilization that maybe they would have actually done had they not been rehydrated. So there's just so many factors, and it's fascinating. So yeah, it's pretty cool. Let's see, somebody said something. Chat. Harvesting is a half room. Okay, sorry. Y'all can read the comments. I'll just keep going. Oh gosh, we're almost out of time. So I'll send around this document where I've answered some of the questions, but one of the really interesting ones that is specifically cultivator centric is asking about what nutrient regimes can positively or negatively affect the synthesis of different nutrient, or the synthesis of terpenes and cannabinoids. And so I did a deep dive into some of the papers. A lot of them really come out of Israel, with Dr. Nurit. She's been doing a lot of work in cannabis nutrition or plant nutrition. And in all of the studies, a lot of them were broken up where she was looking at types of nitrogen types, where she was looking at potassium and phosphorus and toxicities, overfeeding or underfeeding. And it's extremely interesting to see what she found as negatives and toxicities as far as the amount of ppm of nutrients applied versus how the plant handles it in a scenario where she's not, EC stacking. And then we think of today in time where we are EC stacking, where they're putting in tons of fertilizers, to ECs that in a prior life I've never seen as being something you would grow a plant at. And so looking at her numbers that are showing toxicity and looking at the feedings that we're doing now in a commercial setting are very opposite of each other. And so it's difficult to give science-backed data of what the plant is needing and doing when the commercial techniques are different than what's happening in the research setting. I think there's still a lot to learn from these papers, but that's just something I wanted to bring up because somebody did ask about EC stacking. But I'll send this out. One paper goes through nitrogen types. Ultimately, nitrate is the way to go with cannabis. They're not ammonia type loving plants. It tanks yield and it tanks cannabinoid production, as well with potassium. If you're getting subpar or way over accumulation, you're going to get effect from that. And it seems, as reading through here, just about everyone, if it's too high, it's bad. If it's too low, well, that's, that's plant nutrition. It's this delicate balance of making sure your pH is right and making sure you're not overfeeding one molecule where it restricts the uptake of another. But I would highly encourage you to go through these papers because they do list out, under non-stacking circumstances, what they're achieving as far as yields, as far as potency. But also keep in the back of your mind when you're reading that a lot of times in these papers, you'll see that yield is increased. And so because of yield being increased, you're getting more, we'll call it milligrams per plant. But the comparison there is less yield, but higher milligrams, the same milligrams per plant, but that equates to a plant that has a higher potency, but you're getting a lower biomass. So it's really a dilution effect that's happening. So, when you're comparing this to what you're feeding and what you're doing, just keep that in mind. What is the most important? If you can get 5 more percentage points out of having a less, we'll call it a less healthy plant, and you're decreasing your yields, is that worth it because of that lab stamp of approval? Again, something to think about. But any last questions? I know it's over time, so I don't want to take up any more of your time, but if there is anyone that wants to stick around and chat about anything, I'm happy to do so.
Thanks, Allison. This was cool. I'll see everyone later.
No problem. See you later.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Always awesome. Oh.
Seth, I can't tell if you're trying to talk. Yeah, it looks like you're muted on the program or on Meet, Google Meet.
Hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right. Kind of on that subject of nutrients, I just had a simple question of our thoughts on flushing nutrients out at the end of the cycle, benefits of it, or cons of doing it. If you guys have studied that yet, or what's been found about flushing nutrients out, because I hear maybe it's not the best thing in the world anymore. So just curious on your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm getting some echoing. There's been some studies done on it. They're definitely worth checking into, but I think some of the biggest takeaways and some of the limitations is what they were measuring, right? Because in one of the studies, they are, they're restricting nutrients for, 3 weeks, 2 weeks, 1 week, and so on. And, they're finding that as long as you're not going over 2 weeks, you're not getting a decrease in yield, but you're saving on fertilizer, right? So, there's a positive there. There are differences seen in Mike Alden's work that he did with flushing, where there are differences in nutrients that are took up and that are still in the plant, but what that equates to on a quality level is a question mark, right? People say that they can taste high nitrogen, for example, in the bud, but if you don't test for that qualitative response, then you're not really getting an answer for what flushing means. So, I've seen people do it and it be successful. I've seen people do it and claim it doesn't do anything. But I think at the end of the day, none of us are going to know that until we pair it with the qualitative factor. Because even in tobacco research, they limit certain nutrients that are applied to the plant in cultivation because, certain nitrates can cause a harsh smoke. But if you're growing for edibles, then why sacrifice the yield, even if it's just a tiny percent, if you cut off for 3 weeks, for example. So I think there's a balancing act, and definitely a qualitative portion to pair with nutrient content in the flower to really get an answer for that. On a commercial level, if with me growing, I would cut fertilizer off for the last week. You're not hurting yield. Why not save a week's worth of fertilizer if it's easy in your system? But I think today that's kind of where we stand with solid evidence of what flushing may or may not do.
Yeah, thank you. I used to flush for probably like 17 days or so. But now I've kind of went to the middle of it, and we're flushing for about 10 days. Still getting salts out of the media and stuff is the whole thought of doing that, and haven't noticed, any dip in quality or anything. So, and the yields are doing well. So, just interested in, also like at the end, helping with disease and things like that. Botrytis and stuff. Does it help, just feeding throughout the whole cycle?
That is an excellent point, because if you're really dropping your calcium and nitrogen levels, you could be opening up the doorway for weaker plant cells, and for it to be easier for these fungi to consume the plant. So that is definitely a factor to consider if you're a grower that struggles with that. But yeah, it's interesting. It's very fascinating. I mean, it's obviously, you can look at the leaves, it's obviously doing something to the plant. But is it up to our benefit or not is the great question. Dr. Kaplan, I know you have some comments here, holding out on us. Well, okay. Well, thanks everybody so much for joining. We'll try to do this again in October, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks.